The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Annie Maddox felt the sound crack through her chest before her mind fully registered what the judge had said. Not guilty. 2 words. 2 words that unraveled every plan she had made for the last 14 months, every careful arrangement, every quiet goodbye she had practiced in the mirror of her rented room at the Dusty Rose boarding house. She had her train ticket. She had her carpetbag packed. She had told herself that the moment the verdict was read, she would walk out of the Caldwell County Courthouse, climb into the wagon she had hired, and be on the eastbound rail by sundown. She was supposed to leave. That had been the entire point of staying this long, but the verdict changed everything. Because the man sitting across the aisle, the man who had just been declared not guilty of a crime that Annie knew down to the marrow of her bones, he had not committed, turned in his seat and looked directly at her. Not at the prosecutor, not at the judge, not at the gallery of townspeople who were already buzzing with outrage and disbelief. He looked at her. Arthur Rhodes had dark eyes the color of creek water in October, and in that single moment of eye contact, Annie understood something that terrified her far more than anything that had happened inside that courtroom. She did not want to leave. She had never wanted to leave, and the verdict, the truth it confirmed, the justice it delivered, had just ripped away the last excuse she had for running. She stood up so fast her boot heel caught the bench behind her, and the crack of wood against wood drew a dozen eyes. She did not care. She walked out of that courthouse with her chin up and her heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted out, and she told herself she would be on that train by sundown. She was not on that train by sundown. To understand how Annie Maddox ended up standing in a Wild West courtroom with a packed carpetbag and a train ticket, and a verdict that upended her entire life, you have to go back 14 months, to the October afternoon when a stagecoach from Abilene, Kansas, rolled into the town of Harrow Creek and deposited her on the main street like an afterthought. The year was 1882. Harrow Creek sat in the southeast corner of Kansas, the kind of town that had decided it wanted to be permanent just recently enough that the paint on the general store was still fresh, but the jail was already full. The Santa Fe Railroad had come through 2 years prior, which meant Harrow Creek had money now, cattle money, land money, the complicated money that comes when speculators arrive before the lawyers and the lawmen do. It also meant Harrow Creek had secrets, layered ones, the kind that accumulate when fortunes change hands too quickly and too quietly. Annie had not come to Harrow Creek for the secrets. She had come because her employer, the Abilene Tribune, had sent her. She was 26 years old, a reporter, which in 1882 meant she spent most of her professional life convincing people to talk to her while they told her women had no business writing for newspapers. She was slim and dark-haired, with a habit of chewing the end of her pencil when she was thinking and a temper she had learned to keep very carefully behind a polite expression. She had grown up in St. Louis, studied at a women's seminary there, and talked her way into a job at the Tribune when she was 19 by rewriting, without being asked, a front-page story that contained 3 factual errors and handing the corrected version to the editor-in-chief. He had stared at her for a very long time and then told her she could have a desk in the back corner where the light was bad. She had taken it. She had taken everything that came after, every difficult assignment and every door slammed in her face, because she was good at this work, and she knew it, and she had decided a long time ago that other people's discomfort with her ambition was not her problem to solve. The story that brought her to Harrow Creek was the Callaway cattle fraud case. Samuel Callaway, one of the largest landowners in southeastern Kansas, had been accused of falsifying cattle counts to defraud both his business partners and the First Commercial Bank of Caldwell County. The fraud was estimated at somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000, which in 1882 was the kind of number that made grown men pale. Callaway had also, according to the prosecution, arranged for the primary witness against him, a ranch hand named Eli Pruitt, to be charged with horse theft, a charge that conveniently removed Pruitt's testimony from consideration while the trial proceeded. The man charged with Eli Pruitt's alleged horse theft, the man who was supposed to have sold Pruitt the stolen horses, was Arthur Rhodes. Annie had known Arthur's name before she ever saw his face. She had read the case files, such as they were, and she had immediately recognized the shape of the thing being done to him. He was a convenient target. He was 30 years old, a cattleman who had come to the Harrow Creek area 4 years prior from somewhere in Texas that he did not discuss in detail. He had no family in Kansas, no political connections, no wealthy friends who would make noise on his behalf. He had a small but successful operation running cattle on leased land east of town, a reputation for being fair with hired hands and honest in his dealings, and the distinct misfortune of having purchased, entirely legally, 2 horses from a man he knew only as Joe, at a stock auction in Wichita 8 months before anyone had heard of Eli Pruitt. The horses turned out to be stolen. Arthur had no way to know that. He had a receipt from the auction house and 2 witnesses who had seen the transaction. What he did not have was a lawyer, because lawyers in Harrow Creek in 1882 cost money that Arthur had put back into his cattle operation rather than keeping liquid, and the man who had previously helped him with his land lease papers had moved to Topeka 6 months ago. What Arthur Rhodes had, when Annie Maddox arrived in Harrow Creek on that October afternoon, was a cell in the Harrow Creek jail, a looming trial date, and the growing understanding that someone with a great deal of power wanted him convicted. Annie saw him for the first time through the iron bars of the jailhouse window. She had not intended to see him at all that first day. She had intended to check into her room at the boarding house, send a telegraph to the Tribune confirming her arrival, and begin her reporting by visiting the county courthouse to review public records. But she had passed the jailhouse on the way to the Dusty Rose boarding house, and she had heard. She could not explain even to herself how she heard it through the street noise and the wind. She had heard a man's voice reading aloud. She stopped. It was not a thing you expected to hear from a jail. She stepped close to the barred window, which sat low enough that she could peer in without difficulty, and she saw Arthur Rhodes sitting on his bunk with a book open across his knees, reading aloud from what she recognized, after a moment, as a copy of Thomas Hardy. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of hands that spoke to years of physical work. He was reading in a low, careful voice, as though the words mattered to him in a specific way. He looked up and saw her looking. She did not step back the way a more composed woman might have. She said without preamble, because preamble had never been her approach, "Are you Arthur Rhodes?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I am," he said. "Are you lost?" "No," she said. "I am Annie Maddox. I write for the Abilene Tribune. I would like to speak with you about the Calloway case." Something shifted in his expression. Not hope, exactly, more like the careful consideration of a man who had been disappointed enough times to be cautious about the feeling. "You're a reporter," he said. "Yes." "They sent a woman reporter." "They sent the reporter who asked to come," Annie said. "That was me." He was quiet for another moment, and then, to her surprise, he almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It barely reached the corners of his mouth, but it was there. "All right, Miss Maddox," he said. "Pull up some dirt because I don't have a chair to offer you." That was how it started. Annie sitting cross-legged in the dust outside the jailhouse window, her notebook open across her knee, and Arthur Rhodes on his bunk 3 feet away on the other side of bars, talking to her with the kind of careful, precise honesty that she had learned over 7 years of interviewing people was genuinely rare. Most people, when they talked to reporters, performed. They told you the story they wanted told. Arthur told her facts, dates, names. The name of the auction house in Wichita, the name of the clerk who had recorded the sale, the name of the second man who had witnessed the transaction, a traveling merchant named Dougal who made a seasonal circuit through central Kansas. He was not performing innocence. He was simply telling her what had happened, and the shape of what had happened matched, precisely, the shape of what she already suspected. She spent the first week in Harrow Creek interviewing anyone who would talk to her. The town was divided, which she had expected. Calloway had money and the social goodwill that money purchases, and there were plenty of people who found it easier to believe that a newcomer cattleman with no connections had done something crooked than to consider that one of Harrow Creek's most prominent citizens had built his wealth on fraud. But there were also people who did not like Calloway, quietly and carefully, and some of those people talked to Annie. She tracked down the name of the auction house clerk in Wichita by writing 4 letters in 4 days and receiving 1 telegram in reply. The clerk confirmed the sale. She found a reference to Dougal the merchant in a Wichita Beacon article about a local fire from 2 years prior, which gave her a starting point for locating him. She wrote to the Kansas City post offices along his likely route and left word asking Dougal to contact her at the Dusty Rose boarding house in Harrow Creek. She also began reading everything she could find about Samuel Calloway's business dealings. The county clerk, a nervous little man named Tobias Fenn, was initially reluctant to let her review records. She pointed out pleasantly but firmly that the records were public. He let her review them. She found 4 transactions in the past 3 years that did not bear close examination: land transfers at prices that were either dramatically below or dramatically above market value, always with the same 2 men signing as witnesses. She recognized one of the names. It was the county prosecutor handling the case against Arthur Rhodes. This was not a coincidence. Annie did not believe in coincidences when she was working a story. She told Arthur about her findings during their sessions at the jailhouse window, which had by the 2nd week become a daily occurrence, morning and afternoon. She was careful to present facts rather than conclusions, not because she lacked conclusions but because she wanted to see how his mind worked. She had discovered, to her considerable interest, that it worked very well. He asked precise questions. He connected threads she had not yet fully traced and identified twice implications she had missed. He had, she learned, spent 2 years at a university in Austin before family circumstances had brought him back to cattle work, and he had the habit of mind that comes from serious reading even when formal education ends. He also had, she learned gradually, a dark past that he kept in a locked room inside himself and only showed her edges of. Something had happened in Texas, something that had left him alone in Kansas with no family who would come when he wrote to them, and the particular quality of self-reliance that is built not by preference but by necessity. She did not press him on it. She had her own locked rooms. She recognized the architecture. By the end of the 2nd week, she was aware that she looked forward to the mornings more than she had looked forward to anything in a long time. She was aware that she took more care with her appearance than the dust and wind of a Kansas cattle town strictly required. She was aware that when Arthur laughed a real laugh, not the guarded almost smile, it did something warm and inconvenient to her chest. She put this information in a very different locked room and did not examine it. The trial date was set for the 1st of December. Annie had approximately 6 weeks to build a case that would, if she published it, make it impossible for the prosecution to proceed with what she had already determined was a fabricated charge designed to protect Samuel Calloway. She threw herself into the work with everything she had. The break came in the 4th week when Dougal the merchant replied. He had received her letter through a friend in Junction City and he wrote in careful longhand, confirmed that he had witnessed the sale of 2 horses to a man matching Arthur Rhodes's description at the Wichita stock auction. He had not come forward before because no one had asked him. He had not known there was anything to come forward about. He was currently wintering in Emporia and would come to Harrow Creek if needed. Annie wrote back immediately asking him to come. She also published her first article in the Tribune, a careful, factual piece that laid out the timeline of Arthur's arrest, the convenient alignment of Eli Pruitt's removal from the witness pool, and the publicly available information about Calloway's business dealings. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She simply presented facts and asked questions. The Tribune ran it on the front page. The reaction in Harrow Creek was what she had anticipated. Some people were angry, and the angry ones were the people with something to lose. Within 24 hours, the owner of the boarding house received a visit from one of Calloway's men, suggesting that perhaps the Tribune's reporter had overstayed her welcome. Mrs. Clara Dunn, who owned the Dusty Rose and had been feeding Annie excellent chicken pie and increasingly accurate gossip for a month, told the man to remove himself from her establishment or she would remove him, and she had a broom handle and no hesitation about using it. Annie heard about this later and felt a rush of affection for Clara Dunn that she suspected would last the rest of her life. The threats escalated in subtler ways after that. Sources who had been willing to speak to her suddenly became unavailable. The county clerk informed her that the Public Records Office would be closed for renovation for the foreseeable future, a claim that was transparently false. A man she did not know began appearing at various points during her daily movement around Harrow Creek, outside the general store, at the far end of the street near the livery stable, and while he never approached or spoke to her, his presence was clearly intended to be noticed. She noticed it. She also noted it in her journal, with a physical description, date, and time, because she was a reporter and documentation was her armor. She told Arthur about the escalating pressure on one of their morning sessions. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to recognize as his particular way of paying close attention, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "You should be careful," he said. "I am always careful," she said. Annie. He had started using her given name about 2 weeks in, and she had started using his, and neither of them had made anything of it. But something in the way he said it now was different. Lower, more serious. These are not careful men. What Calloway has done, the scale of it, the way he has used the law itself as a weapon against Prout and against me, these are the actions of a man who does not stop. "I know that," she said. "That is why I am doing this." "That is not what I mean," Arthur said. He met her eyes through the bars, and she felt that particular stillness that had started appearing more frequently in his presence, the stillness of being seen exactly as you are, without performance and without judgment. "I mean that I do not want you to be hurt, not for my sake, not for any story." She held his gaze. "Then we had better make sure the story does what it needs to do quickly," she said, which was not what she wanted to say. What she wanted to say was that his concern for her felt different from anything she had received from anyone in a very long time, and it frightened her in a way that none of Calloway's men could. She kept this in the locked room. Dougal arrived in Harrow Creek on the 3rd of November. He was a stout, ruddy-faced man of about 50 with an honest face and a very good memory. He sat in the front room of the Dusty Rose boarding house and told Annie, in detail, about the Wichita stock auction transaction. His recollection aligned precisely with Arthur's. Annie took careful notes and then arranged for Dougal to meet with the attorney she had recently located. The attorney was a discovery of the 6th week. His name was James Faber, and he had practiced law in Caldwell County for 8 years before relocating to nearby Medicine Lodge after a dispute with a client. He was known, according to Clara Dunn, who knew everything, as one of the sharpest legal minds in southeastern Kansas and one of the few men in the region who would take a case on credit. Annie had written to him in the 5th week, and he had come to Harrow Creek to assess the case and had immediately agreed to represent Arthur. Arthur's response when Annie told him through the jailhouse window that she had found him a lawyer had been the most unguarded she had ever seen him. He had been quiet for almost a full minute, and she had understood in that silence the depth of what he had been carrying alone. "How did you arrange that?" he asked finally. "I wrote a very persuasive letter," Annie said. "You are—" He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment and then back at her. "I do not have words for what you are, Annie Maddox." "You have Hardy," she said. "I expect you can find some." He did smile then fully, and it rearranged everything. Faber met with Arthur for 2 hours that afternoon and came out of the jailhouse looking alert and serious in the way of a man who has found exactly the kind of case he likes. He told Annie that the evidence she had gathered, combined with Dougal's testimony and the auction house records, was more than sufficient to establish reasonable doubt. He also told her that he had noticed, in the county records she had flagged, enough irregularity to believe that the charges against Arthur were not merely unfounded but demonstrably fabricated, which was a different and more serious matter. The trial began on December 1st as scheduled. The Caldwell County Courthouse was standing room only. News of Annie's Tribune articles had spread, and there were journalists from Wichita and Topeka present as well, which Annie had anticipated and quietly encouraged through carefully worded letters to colleagues. Calloway's attempt to keep this quiet and local had failed. She sat in the gallery. She was not in the story, not visibly. She was the reporter. She took notes with her pencil, which was new and unbitten, because she was trying to be professional about this, and not about the fact that Arthur Rhodes was sitting at the defendant's table in a clean shirt that someone, she suspected Clara Dunn, had provided. And he looked, despite everything, like a man who was not afraid, and she could not entirely look away. Faber was brilliant. He was precise and methodical and utterly relentless in the way he dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. The auction house records were entered into evidence. Dougal testified in a clear, steady voice that the jury visibly believed. The auction house clerk's signed statement, notarized in Wichita, was presented. When the prosecution attempted to challenge the authenticity of the statement, Faber produced the telegraph confirmation from the Wichita notary's office that Annie had, on her own initiative, obtained 3 days prior. The prosecution had built its case on the assumption that Arthur had no witnesses and no documentation. He now had both, because Annie Maddox had spent 6 weeks and considerable personal risk finding them. The trial lasted 4 days. On the 4th day, the prosecution called its final witness, a man who claimed to have seen Arthur with the stolen horses on a specific date and location. Faber, who had received a name and address from Annie 2 days prior based on a reference she had found in a month-old Harrow Creek register, produced a signed statement from the owner of a ranch 40 miles south showing that Arthur Rhodes had been working on that ranch on the date in question, helping move cattle across a flooded creek. He had been there for 3 days. The owner and 2 hands could attest to it. The prosecution's witness went very pale. He was excused. Faber's closing argument was clean and surgical. He did not make speeches. He simply laid out what the evidence showed. That Arthur Rhodes had purchased horses at a legitimate public auction, that he had witnesses to this, that he had been 40 miles from the location cited in the charge on the date in question, and that the only narrative supporting his guilt was the testimony of a man who had just been demonstrated to be a liar. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Annie sat in the gallery and did not bite her pencil because her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. She pressed them flat on her knees and looked at the back of Arthur's head, the particular way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and she thought about train tickets and Abilene and a desk in the back corner where the light was bad, and she tried to remember why those things felt like home. The verdict came back. Not guilty. The gavel came down and Annie was already standing, already out of the gallery and through the courthouse door before she had made a conscious decision to move, because the alternative was sitting there while Arthur turned and looked at her with those October Creek eyes, and she would have had to decide, right there in front of everyone, who she was in this story. She walked out into the December Kansas afternoon, which was sharp and cold and smelled of horses and wood smoke and coming winter. She walked down the main street of Harrow Creek with her boots loud on the frozen mud and her chin up and her heart in absolute riot, and she went to the Dusty Rose boarding house and stood in her room in front of her packed carpetbag and her train ticket and tried to remember what the plan had been. The plan had been simple. She came. She reported. The story ran. The trial happened. She left. She had always been leaving. That was the nature of her work. She arrived somewhere. She found the truth. She wrote it down, and then she got back on the train and went somewhere else, because she had learned, through some combination of experience and self-preservation, that staying anywhere led to the kind of entanglement that made it harder to do the work. She had never entangled herself before. She was not the sort of woman who entangled herself. She was the sort of woman who had excellent professional relationships and admirable personal discipline, and a desk in the back corner with bad light where she was enormously, impeccably, sometimes heartbreakingly productive. She sat down on the edge of the bed next to her carpetbag and stared at the wall. A knock came at the door. She knew before she answered who it would be. She also knew or suspected that Clara Dunn had told him which room was hers, because Clara Dunn was the sort of woman who knew everything about everything and approved of most of it. "Come in," Annie said, and her voice came out steady, which was a small miracle. Arthur Rhodes opened the door and stood in the frame of it, and she had not seen him standing since the night she arrived at Harrow Creek, since he had been in the jailhouse every time they spoke. He was taller than she had assembled from fragments and impressions. He was still wearing the clean shirt from the trial, and he had his hat in his hands, which he was turning slowly between his fingers in a gesture she recognized as the physical expression of something he was working out how to say. "I was told you were leaving tonight," he said. "I have a ticket for the evening train," Annie said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "I came to say thank you. The things you did, the attorney, the witnesses, the records, I would not have gotten out of that trial. Not without you." "You would have," Annie said, which was not entirely true. "The truth was there to be found." "The truth is always there to be found," Arthur said quietly. "Someone has to decide it's worth finding." She looked away from him because looking directly at him was becoming something that required more steadiness than she currently had. "You will be all right now," she said. "Faber will speak with the circuit judge about the implications for the Calloway case. The Wichita and Topeka papers will keep the pressure on. There are enough public records of irregularity that Calloway's fraud will come to light properly now. You won't need to worry about being used as a convenient target again." "I know," he said. He was still standing in the doorway, still turning his hat. "Annie, Mr. Rhodes." "That's the first time you've called me that in 6 weeks," he said, and there was the ghost of that rearranging smile. She felt it in her ribs. "I am trying to be appropriate," she said, "since I am leaving." "What if you didn't?" he said. The question landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples went outward, and she sat on the edge of the bed next to her packed carpetbag and looked at him and said nothing, because she had no prepared answer for this. She had prepared answers for most things, professional and personal alike. She had not prepared an answer for Arthur Rhodes asking her to stay. "I have a job," she said finally, "in Abilene. I know that. I cannot simply, I am a reporter, Arthur. I have assignments, I have a desk." "I know that too." He came into the room then, not all the way, just enough to close the door behind him, and he stopped a careful, respectful distance away. He was not pressing her. He was never pressing. That had been one of the things about him, from the very first morning at the jailhouse window, that she had found quietly extraordinary. He had never once, in 6 weeks of being in a desperate situation that would have entitled most men to all manner of demand and manipulation, pressed her for anything. He had answered her questions. He had trusted her with the truth. He had worried about her safety. He had not used her feelings against her, which she recognized now had grown obvious enough that a far less observant man would have noticed them. "I am not asking you to give up your work," he said. "I am only—" He stopped. He looked at his hat and then back at her. "I am 30 years old, Annie, and I have been careful my whole adult life about not wanting things I cannot have. And I have been very unsuccessful at it this time, and I thought I should tell you that before you got on the train, because you deserve to know it and I need you to know it, whatever you decide to do with the information." The practical, disciplined, professionally excellent part of Annie Maddox that had been running her life for 26 years had a response prepared. It involved gratitude and appropriate distance, and the kind of gentle finality that does not leave wounds. She knew exactly what it sounded like. She had used it before. She did not say any of it. "I have been writing my best article since I arrived in this town," she said instead, which was true and also completely beside the point, and he seemed to understand that she was talking around the edges of something she was working up to. "You have," he agreed, with a seriousness that she suspected contained amusement. "The light at the Tribune is very bad," she said. "I imagine it is. I have an apartment in Abilene, above a dry goods store. It is extremely practical and not at all." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She was Annie Maddox. She had walked into jail windows and records rooms and hostile interview rooms, and she had once memorably talked her way into a closed city council meeting in St. Louis by convincing the doorman she was the stenographer. She was not afraid of anything, professionally speaking. She was terrified of this. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Arthur said gently. "I know I don't," she said, "but I think I already have." She did not get on the evening train. She went down to the station and sent a telegraph to the Tribune, explaining that she had additional reporting to pursue in Harrow Creek and would be delayed by 2 weeks. Then she went back to the Dusty Rose and had dinner with Clara Dunn and Arthur Rhodes and James Faber, who had stayed an extra day to make sure the paperwork following the acquittal was handled correctly. And they ate Clara's excellent chicken pie and drank coffee and talked about the Calloway case and what would come next. What came next, in the weeks that followed, was both more complicated and more extraordinary than Annie had expected. The Calloway fraud case did move forward, exactly as she had anticipated. The circuit court judge, presented with Faber's carefully documented irregularities and the Tribune's published reports, ordered a formal investigation into Calloway's business records in mid-December. The investigation was conducted by a federal marshal out of Topeka, because the involvement of the county prosecutor in Calloway's dealings made local oversight impossible. Annie reported on this process with thorough, meticulous precision, filing 2 articles a week that were now running not just in the Tribune but in papers in Wichita, Topeka, and Kansas City. Her editor, the same man who had given her the desk in the back corner with bad light, sent her a telegram in the 3rd week that read, "Maddox, exceptional work. Take whatever time you need. Rhodes." She read this telegram to Arthur over the supper table at Clara's boarding house, and he laughed, which she was learning to collect the way other people collected pressed flowers, because it was warm and genuine, and it made December in Kansas feel less cold. The 2 weeks became a month. The month became complicated. Arthur, once released from jail, had returned to his cattle operation east of town, which his hired man, a quiet fellow named Tom Bright, had maintained in his absence without complaint or crisis. This spoke well of both Tom Bright and Arthur's management. Arthur was up before dawn and working through most of the day, rebuilding the small disruptions that 6 weeks of absent ownership had created. Annie, who had structured her days around the jailhouse visits, had to restructure them around the reality of a man who was alive and present, and moving through the world rather than contained and accessible through bars. She restructured them. She told herself this was purely practical. She needed a source in the Calloway case, and Arthur was a primary source, and it was journalistically sound to maintain regular contact. She told herself this while wearing her nicer blouse on the mornings she rode out to the cattle operation to conduct these strictly journalistic meetings. Arthur met her with coffee and whatever information she needed, and also with the particular attention that he gave her that was different from any attention she had received from any person in her professional or personal life. It was not the attention of someone performing interest or managing her. It was the attention of someone who was genuinely, completely engaged with what she was saying and thinking, who asked questions that went past the surface of her words to the ideas underneath them, who remembered things she had mentioned once in passing and brought them back weeks later in ways that showed he had been thinking about them too. They began to take evening rides. This was, she told herself, because she needed to know the landscape for the articles she was writing about the Callaway Ranch operations. The fact that the rides consistently ended near the creek east of the cattle operation, where the cottonwood trees held onto their last gold leaves well into December, and the water was very still and very clear, was simply a function of the terrain. It was on one of these rides in the third week of December that the story about Texas emerged. They had dismounted to let the horses drink. The light was going amber and low, the way Kansas winter light does in the late afternoon, turning everything to brass and shadow. Arthur was standing at the water's edge looking at the reflection of the sky in the current, and Annie, who had been waiting for weeks with the patient, respectful restraint she had never had to exercise with any story subject before, said, "You never told me about Texas." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not. Then he said, "My family had a cattle operation south of San Antonio, my father's. I was working it with him and my younger brother Daniel when I was 23. He stopped. Started again. My father was not a careful man with money. He was brilliant with cattle, but he borrowed against the ranch in amounts that I did not fully understand until it was too late, and when I was 24 the bank called the loan and the ranch went under. My father did not another pause. He did not survive the loss of it, not financially, not in any way." Annie stood very still. She understood from the precise, careful way he was speaking that he was telling her about a death and that the death had been his father's own choice. She did not speak. "Daniel blamed me," Arthur said. "I was the eldest. I had been managing the operation alongside my father, and Daniel believed, and perhaps he was not entirely wrong, that I should have seen what was coming sooner and done something to prevent it. We argued, badly. He turned a pebble over in his hand. I left. I should not have left, probably. But I was 24 and I was carrying my father's death and my brother's accusations, and I did not know what to do with any of it, so I went north." "Have you spoken to Daniel since?" Annie asked. "I have written twice," Arthur said. "He has not written back. He looked at the creek. I understand it. I do not think it makes him correct, but I understand it. Grief does extraordinary things to the way people assign blame." Annie thought about her own family, her own particular locked room, which contained a mother who had wanted a different kind of daughter and a father who had died when she was 16, and left her with a pile of his books and the unspoken permission to read everything, be everything, afraid of nothing. She thought about how much of who she was had been built in response to loss. "I lost my father when I was 16, she said. "He was the one who thought I should write." Arthur looked at her. "My mother thought I should marry," she said. "We have a polite relationship now from a distance which suits us both. I send her articles sometimes. She sends me her approval of the articles and her disapproval of the profession. We have managed it." Arthur almost smiled. "She hasn't read the ones about Callaway yet." "She has," Annie said. "She sent me a telegram last week. It said, 'Dangerous work. Good article. Please eat properly,' which from my mother is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation." Arthur did laugh then, fully. And she was adding it to her collection, and she was also very aware of how close they were standing, and how late the light was getting, and how the horses were patient and unbothered at the water's edge, and how there was no particular reason to be anywhere else. "Annie," Arthur said, and her name and his voice had taken on a whole new frequency since that evening in her room at the boarding house. "I know you have been delaying your return to Abilene." "I have additional reporting," she said. "You do," he agreed. "You also know that the Callaway investigation will be handled now, and the federal marshal has every piece of documentation you've gathered, and the story will run whether you are here or in Abilene." "Yes," she said. "So you're staying because you want to," he said. "Not because you have to." She looked at the creek and the brass afternoon light and the cottonwood reflections, and she thought about the locked room and what was in it, and she thought about the fact that she had been a reporter for 7 years, and the entire professional and philosophical foundation of that career was the conviction that truth deserved to be spoken even when it was inconvenient. "Yes," she said, I am staying because I want to." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the specific kind of silence that contains a great deal. Arthur turned to face her fully. He was not a man who made hasty movements in any direction. He reached out and took her hand, which was bare because she had taken her glove off to write notes earlier and not put it back, and the warmth of his hand around hers in the December cold was the most straightforward, uncomplicated thing she could remember feeling in years. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you are willing to consider." She looked up at him. She thought about the desk in the back corner and the apartment above the dry goods store, and the long, excellent, somewhat solitary life she had built on her own terms. She thought about the way he had looked at her through the jailhouse bars reading Thomas Hardy. She thought about the fact that the best 6 weeks of her professional life had also been, almost certainly, the best 6 weeks of her personal one, and that both of those things were attributable to the same person. "I would like that," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old-fashioned and serious and utterly without irony. And Annie Maddox, who had walked into closed council meetings and hostile interviews and every manner of professional adversity without flinching, felt her knees go unreliable for the first time in her adult life. They rode back in the December dusk, and Arthur was quiet and present, and the sky over the Kansas plain was purple and gold, and full of the particular promise of winter evenings, and Annie thought that she would need to write to her editor again. She would need to explain something more complicated than additional reporting. She was not entirely sure how to explain it, but she was a writer, and she had faith that she would find the words. The courtship of Annie Maddox and Arthur Rhodes, conducted in the small, close-watched world of Harrow Creek, Kansas, in the winter of 1882, was the subject of considerable interest among the town's population and considerable happiness to Clara Dunn, who told anyone who would listen that she had known how it would go from the moment Annie walked in off the Abilene stage. It was not a simple courtship. Annie was not a simple woman, and Arthur was not a simple man, and the circumstances of their meeting had built them both a foundation of honesty that made ordinary romantic pretense feel foreign and unnecessary. They did not pretend with each other. They had not had the luxury of pretending from the beginning, with bars between them and a trial date approaching and a powerful man trying to engineer a false conviction, and so they carried that directness into courtship, and it made things both easier and more intense than Annie imagined most courtships were. They had disagreements, real ones. In January, Annie's follow-up article on the Callaway investigation took a direction that Arthur thought was legally premature, suggesting implications about the county prosecutor's involvement before the federal investigation had formally confirmed anything. They argued about it at Clara's supper table with the heat that comes from two people who respect each other enough to disagree genuinely, and Annie published the article with minor modifications, and Arthur read it the next morning and told her he understood why she had made the choices she had, even if he still thought the timing was aggressive. She told him he was probably right about the timing. He told her the article was important anyway. This, she discovered, was what real respect between two people looked like. Not the absence of disagreement, but the presence of continued engagement and good faith after the disagreement ended. The Callaway investigation concluded in February 1883. The findings were definitive. Samuel Callaway had defrauded his business partners and the First Commercial Bank of Caldwell County of $62,000 over the course of 7 years. The county prosecutor, one Oliver Marsh, was charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice for his role in fabricating the case against Arthur. Eli Pruitt, whose horse theft charge was revealed as part of the same manufactured scheme, had the charges against him vacated. Both Callaway and Marsh faced trial in the spring. Annie filed 3 major articles on the conclusion of the investigation, and received her first journalism award for the series from the Kansas Press Association, which was presented at a ceremony in Topeka in March. She went to Topeka to receive it and came back to Harrow Creek to Arthur, which she had not fully decided to do until she was on the returning train and understood that the decision had already been made for her somewhere below the level of conscious choice. She told Arthur about this on the ride back from the station, how she had been sitting on the train in the dark looking at the award certificate and feeling, for the first time in her professional life, that the thing she most wanted to get back to was not the work. "That must have been alarming," Arthur said, with the serious expression he used when he was most amused. "Profoundly," Annie said. They were married in April 1883. The wedding was at the Harrow Creek Church, a small white building that had been completed only 6 months prior and smelled of new pine and candle wax. Clara Dunn cried with magnificent unself-consciousness from the front pew. James Faber came from Medicine Lodge and stood with Arthur. Annie's friend Ruth from the Tribune came from Abilene and stood with Annie and whispered, just before they walked in, that she had read every article in the series and was insufferably proud, and also that the man waiting at the end of the aisle had very fine shoulders. Annie had worn a dress of deep blue wool that her mother had sent from St. Louis with a note that said simply, "Your father would have liked him." This was the most her mother had given her in 10 years, and she had held it in her hands on the morning of the wedding until she felt steady enough to walk. The ceremony was read by a minister named Caldecott, who was also the town's postmaster, and took both roles with equal gravity. Arthur stood at the altar looking like a man who had walked a long and difficult road, and had, against considerable odds, arrived exactly where he was supposed to be. He was wearing a dark coat that fit properly, and he was looking at Annie the entire time she walked toward him, and she was looking at him, and Harrow Creek watched them look at each other, and felt it was witnessing something worth remembering. He said his vows in the same precise, careful voice she had first heard reading Thomas Hardy through a jailhouse window, and she understood that he meant every word with the same seriousness that he brought to everything, and she said hers in return with the full weight of a woman who had chosen this, openly and clearly, in the same spirit she brought to everything worth doing. They were married. It was April in Kansas, and the prairie was coming green, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to bud, and Annie Maddox became Annie Rhodes and found, to her continued surprise, that the name sat beside her own with perfect ease rather than displacement. They moved into the ranch house east of town, which Arthur had expanded in March with the help of 3 hired men and Clara Dunn's architectural opinions, delivered with such frequency and specificity that she had essentially designed the addition. There was a room with a large east-facing window that got good morning light, which Arthur had built specifically, without being asked, as a writing room for Annie. She stood in it the first morning in the house and looked at the light coming gold and clean through the glass and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for years. She kept writing. She continued her work for the Tribune and expanded to the Kansas City Star in the spring, filing longer pieces on land rights and railroad influence and the particular political pressures of the frontier that were shaping Kansas in ways that would matter for generations. She was good at this work, and she loved it, and Arthur understood this completely, in the way that 2 people who have been honest with each other from the beginning understand the shape of each other's essential natures. He learned, over the spring and summer, to read her working moods. When she was deep in an article, he left coffee outside the writing room door and did not knock. When she was finished and surfacing, he knew it by a particular restlessness in the house and would suggest a ride or a supper at Clara's, and she was always glad of both. She learned the rhythms of the cattle operation, not because she had any intention of working it, but because it was his work and she found it genuinely interesting. She learned about grass and water and the long mathematics of cattle management, which was more complex than it looked from outside, and she learned to read the land the way he did, seeing it as a system with its own logic rather than simply scenery. The summer brought a dry spell that worried the region's cattle people considerably. Arthur managed it by moving his herd to pasture near the creek with a calm efficiency that Annie watched and wrote about privately in her journal rather than the newspaper, because some things you observe for yourself and not for publication. He found her journal once. Not deliberately. It had slipped from the writing table and he had picked it up off the floor, and it had fallen open to an entry from February, before the wedding, in which she had written with some detailed honesty about what it felt like to realize she was in love with him. He had told her about finding it that evening, because he was incapable of not telling her, which was one of the things she loved about him. He had said he had only read one paragraph before he closed it and left it on the writing table, and from his expression, it had been the February paragraph, and the conversation that followed had been one of the more remarkable of Annie's life. The Callaway trial concluded in August 1883. Samuel Callaway was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and sentenced to 7 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary. Oliver Marsh received 3 years for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Eli Prout, vindicated, had quietly relocated to Colorado and was, by all accounts, working cattle there without further incident. Annie wrote the final article in her Callaway series with a satisfaction that was clean and complete. She filed it, received a letter from her editor calling it the finest work of her career, and went out to the porch of the ranch house in the August evening with a cup of coffee and looked at the Kansas sky, which was enormous and clear and full of stars, and felt that rare and genuine thing, resolution. The story was finished, every thread tied, every truth accounted for. Arthur came out and sat beside her on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders touched. He looked at the same sky. "It's done," she said. "It is," he said. "The right people are where they should be," she said. Callaway in a cell, Prout free, you free, she paused, me here. He was quiet in the warm, attentive way he had. Then he said, "Where you are supposed to be." She thought about the verdict in December, the gavel coming down, the way she had walked out of the courthouse into the cold and stood in her room with her packed bag and her train ticket and all her careful plans for leaving, and how the plans had dissolved the way morning frost does when the sun reaches it, not dramatically, not with a struggle, just inevitably and thoroughly. "Yes," she said, "where I am supposed to be." He brought his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, which was still, 8 months into knowing him, a pleasure she had not adjusted to and did not want to, because the day she stopped noticing how good it felt to be close to Arthur Rhodes would be the day something had gone wrong. They sat on the porch until the stars shifted, and the coffee cooled, and the horses in the near pasture moved once, slowly, and settled again. In September, Annie's mother came from St. Louis to visit, which was the first time they had been in the same place in 3 years. It was a complicated visit, as all interactions between Annie and her mother were complicated, but the complication had changed in quality. Her mother, Annie Maddox, was a small, sharp-featured woman who had raised a daughter she did not entirely recognize and loved her with a fierceness that had never quite learned to express itself directly. She walked into the ranch house and looked around it with the thoroughness of a woman cataloging a situation, and then she looked at Arthur, who was entirely calm under this scrutiny, and said, "You read to yourself in jail." Arthur, unfazed, said, "I did." "Thomas Hardy," Harriet said. "Among others," Arthur said. Harriet was quiet for a moment. "Annie wrote that in one of her articles," she said. "That was the first thing she mentioned about you. I thought anyone who reads in a jail is either lost or very focused, and I am pleased to see it was the latter." Arthur looked at Annie with an expression that she recognized as warmly delighted. She looked back at him with an expression she hoped communicated that she had absolutely mentioned this to her mother in an article, and she was not apologizing for it. The visit lasted 10 days. By the end of it, Harriet had given Clara Dunn 3 recipes from St. Louis and received 2 from Clara in return, had expressed her opinions about the writing room's window being positioned to catch afternoon glare as well as morning light and been correct, and had told Arthur in a private conversation that Annie had not been present for that she was glad her daughter had found someone who understood the value of her work without needing to diminish it. Arthur told Annie about this conversation that night, because again, incapable of not. Annie stared at the ceiling of their bedroom for a considerable while and then said, "My mother is more complex than she appears." "So are you," Arthur said. "She said you understand the value of my work." "I do," Arthur said simply. "It is exceptional work. It changed my life and probably saved it. It's changed other lives too, through the Calloway case. Why would I not value it?" She turned her head to look at him in the dark. "Most men in 1883 Kansas would find reasons," she said. "Most men in 1883 Kansas are wrong about a great number of things," Arthur said. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the easy, familiar tenderness that had become part of the daily texture of her life. "I am trying very hard not to be one of them." She covered his hand with hers. "You are succeeding," she said. The autumn of 1883 was golden and long, the way autumn sometimes is in Kansas when it decides to be generous. Annie's work was going exceptionally well. A piece she had written in July about water rights along the Arkansas River had been picked up by a New York paper and reprinted, which was the first time her work had reached that distance east, and her editor was discussing the possibility of her filing a regular column. Arthur's cattle operation had had a strong year despite the summer dry spell, and the expanded ranch house had become, in a way that neither of them had quite planned, something of a gathering place. Tom Bright and his wife, Nora, came for Sunday suppers. Clara came weekly. James Faber visited from Medicine Lodge once a month and always stayed for dinner. In November, Annie learned she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Arthur, not because she was afraid to, but because she wanted to know what she felt about it before she had to put it into words. She sat in the writing room in the morning light and turned the information over in her mind, and discovered that she felt, beneath the natural considerable apprehension of the practical and physical reality, something wide and clear that she eventually identified as joy. She told Arthur that evening after supper. He went very still for a moment, and she watched his face through the journey of the news, saw him arrive at the other side of it with something in his expression that she had no word for in any language she knew, something large and grateful, and beyond the ordinary vocabulary of happiness. He put his arms around her and held her, and they stood in the kitchen of their ranch house for a long time without saying anything at all. The pregnancy was straightforward and healthy. Annie continued working throughout, which was not remarkable to her, but was the subject of various opinions from various people, none of whose opinions she solicited or considered. She filed her Arkansas River water rights series through December, and started a new series in January 1884 about the role of small cattle operations in the changing Kansas economy, which drew on her direct experience in a way that made it arguably her strongest work yet. Their son was born in July 1884, on a Tuesday morning when the prairie was fully awake, and the light was the particular gold of midsummer. He was healthy and loud, and had Arthur's dark hair from the first hour and Annie's expression of intense assessment, and they named him Edward James Rhodes. Edward for Annie's father, James for James Faber, who had become family in the way that some people not born into your life become more essential to it than those who were. Arthur held Edward for the first time with the focused, complete attention he brought to everything that mattered, and Annie watched him from the bed and felt that the word that best described her life at that moment was full. Not just full in the way of being occupied or satisfied, but full in the older, deeper sense complete. Clara Dunn came within the hour and cried again, joyfully and without embarrassment. Tom and Nora Bright came the next day, and Nora, who had 3 children of her own, and was therefore an authority on all matters infant-related, gave Annie advice that was practical and unpatronizing and genuinely helpful, which Annie received with the same open gratitude she tried to bring to good information, whatever its source. Edward thrived. He was a good-natured baby who became a curious, energetic toddler, interested in everything, particularly horses, which he communicated clearly from an age at which he could barely walk by pointing at every horse he saw with an expression of absolute urgency. Arthur, who had a young mare that was particularly gentle, began sitting with Edward on the mare's back before the boy could walk independently, supporting him carefully, and Annie watched this from the porch and wrote none of it down because it was not a thing to be reported on but to be simply had and carried forward. She did write it in her journal. She had kept the journal throughout, more faithfully than she had kept any record before, because she had discovered that her life had become interesting in a way that was entirely different from the professional kind of interesting, and she wanted to be honest about it, the way she tried to be honest about everything. In 1885, she wrote a piece for the Kansas City Star that examined the changes in southeastern Kansas over the preceding 5 years. The arrival of the railroad, the consolidation of land under a small number of wealthy owners, the displacement of small operators, the particular story of the Callaway fraud as a case study in how financial power could distort the instruments of justice. It was the longest piece she had ever written, and it ran in 3 installments and caused significant conversation. She received letters about it for months, including one from a law professor in Chicago who said it was the finest piece of legal journalism he had read in 5 years, and asked permission to reproduce it for classroom use. She gave permission. She told Arthur about the letter at supper, and he said he was not surprised, and she told him he was biased, and he said that having direct evidence of a thing was not bias, and she said it was when you were emotionally invested in the evidence, and he said she should take that argument up with the law professor who had no reason to be emotionally invested. Edward, who was 11 months old and eating mashed potato with great sincerity, contributed nothing to this conversation, but banged his spoon against his bowl in what Annie chose to interpret as approval. The spring of 1886 brought a letter from Daniel Rhodes. Arthur received it one morning in March, and Annie knew from the way he went quiet and set down his coffee that it was something significant. He read it through twice, and then set it on the table and looked at the window for a while. She waited because she was good at waiting for the things that mattered. "It's from Daniel," he said. "Your brother," she said. "Yes." He picked up the letter again, turning it. "He's in Oklahoma Territory. He's been there 2 years working cattle. A pause. He says he has been thinking a long time about what he said to me after our father died. He says he was wrong to blame me. He says he knows that now." Annie was quiet. "He says he read about the Callaway case," Arthur said, "in a paper that made it up to the Territory. He says he read it and he was proud." His voice changed slightly on the last word, in the specific way of a person encountering an emotion they had given up expecting. "Are you going to write back?" Annie asked. "I think I might go," Arthur said. "If you would come, I think I would like you there." They went to Oklahoma Territory in May 1886. It was a 3-day journey south and west, first by train to Arkansas City, and then by wagon into the Territory, which was raw and wide, and had a frontier quality that made Harrow Creek seem established by comparison. Daniel Rhodes was working on a large cattle operation near the Cimarron River, and he met them at the edge of the operations yard with the particular careful expression of a man who has rehearsed a conversation many times and is not sure any of the rehearsal has been adequate. He was 3 years younger than Arthur and looked like him in the way that brothers do, the same height and the same darkness about the eyes, but where Arthur's manner was settled and contained, Daniel's was more restless, the manner of a man who had been moving fast for a long time and had not yet fully trusted himself to slow down. He shook Arthur's hand, and then, after a moment in which the years between them were somehow visible in the air, He embraced his brother, briefly and without ceremony, and Arthur embraced him back. Annie stood a polite distance away and looked at the Oklahoma sky, which was enormous and doing something magnificent with the late afternoon light, and she thought about locked rooms and the things you carry alone for too long. Daniel was attentive and careful with Annie in a way that she understood as his form of apology to Arthur, treating the person Arthur loved well as the most direct available expression of the regard he could not yet find the full words for. He told her, over supper at the bunkhouse where the operations cook had produced an improbable feast, that he had read all of her Tribune articles about the Calloway case. "The one about using the law as a weapon," he said. "That one stayed with me because I did that not legally, but I used what happened as a weapon when I needed someone to blame." He looked at his plate and then at Arthur. "I was wrong." "I know you were," Arthur said. "I also know why." "I could have written sooner," Daniel said. "You wrote when you were ready to mean it," Arthur said. "That's the better time to write." Annie thought about this exchange for a long time afterward. She thought about it on the wagon back to Arkansas City, watching Arthur ride beside the wagon on the horse he had brought from the Harrow Creek operation, while Daniel walked out their remaining conversation alongside him. She thought about the specific way that grief and guilt tangle into silence and how much courage it takes, sometimes, to untangle them. She added it to the journal. She did not write an article about it. Some truths are for keeping, not reporting. They returned to Harrow Creek in late May, richer in some way that was not about money. Arthur was quieter for a few days and then gradually less so, as though something that had been holding itself tense had finally released its grip. He wrote to Daniel regularly after that, and Daniel wrote back, and the letters arrived on the same day as Edward's second birthday, and Annie put them together in her mind as a kind of gift of recovery. The world returning things to people who had waited long enough and done the work. The summer of 1886 was their best summer. Annie's column in the Kansas City Star was now established, and she had been approached about compiling the Calloway series and her Arkansas River water rights series into a book, which a publisher in Chicago had expressed interest in. She spent the summer evenings in the writing room working on the manuscript, with the door open to catch the evening air and the sounds of the ranch, and Arthur would bring her coffee at 9 o'clock without being asked and lean in the doorway for a few minutes, and she would tell him where she had gotten, and he would listen with the full quality of his attention that never made her feel the work was a burden on him. Edward walked at 12 months and ran at 13, and showed no inclination to slow down at any subsequent point. He was currently using the porch steps as a personal challenge course with a focus and determination that Annie recognized as embarrassingly similar to her own, and Arthur found openly delightful. She was expecting again by September. This time she knew sooner and told Arthur the same evening, and his response was the same full stillness, and then the embrace, and she thought that you could prepare for things and they would still arrive fresh. The autumn of 1886 passed in the golden domestic richness of a life that is going right. Annie finished the first draft of the manuscript in October and sent it to the Chicago publisher, who replied within 2 weeks saying it was extraordinary and he wanted to publish it in the spring of 1887. She told Arthur at supper, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said with absolute seriousness, "I would like to read it before it goes to press. Not to change anything, just because it's yours and I want to read it." She gave him the manuscript and he read it over 4 evenings, in the chair by the lamp in the parlor while she did the secondary editing, and he said, when he had finished, that it was the finest thing he had read since Hardy, and she told him that was a ridiculous comparison, and he said he meant it entirely. She believed him, which was the remarkable thing. She had received professional praise and personal praise and combinations of both throughout her career, and she had learned to evaluate it with a reasonable skepticism. When Arthur said it, she simply believed him, because he did not say things he did not mean. Their daughter was born in April 1887, in the same week that the Chicago publisher sent the first bound copies of the book. Her name was Margaret Eliza Rhodes, Margaret for Arthur's mother, who had died when he was 19, and Eliza for Clara Dunn's given first name, which Clara had not used in 40 years and which she received, when informed of the honor, by sitting down very suddenly and crying in a different quality from her usual joyful variety, something deeper and more private. Edward, who was nearly 3 and in the grip of an intense curiosity about everything, approached his sister with the same expression of focused assessment that he had previously applied to horses, which suggested a healthy attitude toward new experiences. He sat beside Annie on the bed and regarded Margaret Eliza with great seriousness and eventually declared, with the authority of a child who has decided something, "Mine." Annie looked at Arthur, who was watching his son with an expression she needed her journal for. She wrote it down that evening, the whole scene, Edward and the serious declaration and Arthur's face, because she wanted to have it exactly right for later, for the years ahead when they would tell it. The book published in May 1887 and was reviewed in 4 papers, 3 favorably and 1 with the specific hostility of a man who objected to a woman's name on a book about law and justice. Annie read the hostile review once and then used it to line Edward's toy box, which she felt was an appropriate literary fate. The spring of 1887 was full and bright. Arthur's operation had expanded, carefully and sustainably, to include a second pasture lease north of town that Tom Bright managed with authority and confidence. The Callaway fraud case had become a significant reference point in Kansas legal circles, cited in 2 subsequent proceedings involving financial irregularity, which Annie noted with satisfaction in the column she wrote in May marking the 5th anniversary of Arthur's acquittal. She did not write the column as journalism about the case. She wrote it as something more personal, about what justice requires when it is being weaponized, the particular kind of courage it takes to go looking for truth when the people with power want it buried. She wrote it thinking about Arthur in the jailhouse reading Hardy, and about Eli Prout, who had suffered a fabricated charge and disappeared quietly into Colorado, and about all the people for whom there was no reporter who happened to peer through a jailhouse window. Arthur read the column when it came and said it was the best thing she had written. She told him he said that about everything she wrote, and he said he meant it every time, and the difference was that this time he could prove it was the best because it was the most fully hers. She sat with this evaluation in the writing room the next morning, and thought that the thing about loving someone who truly knew you was that their opinions about you became a mirror you could actually trust, which was terrifying and invaluable in equal measure. Daniel came to visit in the summer of 1887. He arrived from Oklahoma Territory on a Tuesday afternoon and was immediately assessed by Edward with the same focused seriousness that Edward brought to all new people, and declared acceptable within approximately 10 minutes, which Daniel received with a surprised, pleased expression. He stayed 2 weeks. It was, Annie understood from watching the 2 brothers, the real beginning of their reconstruction, not the letter in March of the previous year, which had been essential, but this. The daily proximity, the ordinary suppers, the shared work on the ranch when Daniel rolled up his sleeves and helped without being asked, the gradual reduction of the careful self-consciousness that had characterized Daniel's first interactions with Arthur into something more relaxed and more real. On the last evening before Daniel left, Annie found the 2 of them sitting on the porch after supper, and she brought coffee and set it between them and went back inside, because some conversations needed only the 2 people who had been waiting to have them. She listened to the sound of their voices through the open window, not the words. She was careful not to listen to the words, just the sound, the rhythm of 2 people talking without armor, and she thought that it was a particular kind of grace, the grace of resolution, of things that have been broken being carefully mended over time. Daniel left on Wednesday morning and told Annie, with a directness that reminded her of his brother, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to the Rhodes family, which she thought was excessive and said so. And he said he was a cattleman and had no reason to exaggerate, and she told him she was a journalist and would need to verify the claim. And he laughed in a way that was so like Arthur's that she felt something warm and grateful for the resilience of people who come back from the dark. Harrow Creek in the late 1880s was growing. The railroad had brought growth it could not entirely manage, and the town was in the process of becoming more formally itself. A second church in 1887, a proper school building in 1888, a doctor who stayed permanently rather than riding the circuit in 1889. Annie was involved in the school's establishment, serving on the committee that hired the teacher and organized the curriculum, because she felt strongly about education and had opinions about it that she expressed clearly and at some length, and that generally prevailed. Edward started at the school in 1889 when he was 5 and announced on the second day that the teacher knew things and this was interesting to him. The teacher, Miss Holbrook, who was 23 and from Ohio, and had not previously encountered a 5-year-old who approached school with the attitude of a professional reviewer, wrote Annie a note saying that Edward was a remarkable child, and she was enjoying him enormously. Annie showed the note to Arthur and he read it, and said that was a very polite way of saying their son was exhausting, and she told him that was parenthood. Margaret Eliza, called Maggie from the beginning by Edward and therefore by everyone, was growing into a sturdy, cheerful child with Annie's dark hair and Arthur's October Creek eyes, and a laugh that Clara Dunn said was the best sound to come out of a person since the Hallelujah chorus. She was deeply interested in horses, like her brother, and in animals generally, and she had already, at 2, made friends with every dog in Harrow Creek, which was a social accomplishment that Annie respected. Annie and Arthur had, in the manner of people who have been happy for long enough to trust it, stopped being surprised by their happiness and started simply living inside it. Not complacently. There was always work, always the small and large negotiations of two strong-willed people building a shared life, always the specific vulnerability of loving someone in a world that has no guarantees. But they had stopped waiting for it to end and started accepting it as the reality of their days, which is a different and more generous way to be in a life. Clara Dunn, in 1889, sold the Dusty Rose boarding house to a young couple from Missouri who wanted to run it as a hotel, and moved into a small house 3 doors down from the school, which she said she had always wanted, and which the neighborhood considered a significant improvement in their quality of life. She was 58 that year and in vigorous health, and showed no signs of slowing down in any respect. She was present at every significant event in Harrow Creek, and continued to know everything about everything. She was also, in these years, a constant presence for Annie's children, who called her Aunt Clara, and received from her the particular gift that older people with large hearts give to children, the gift of being treated as genuinely interesting, their concerns and observations taken seriously without condescension. In the spring of 1890, Annie received a letter from her mother saying that Harriet's health had taken a turn, and that she would appreciate a visit. Annie went to St. Louis for 3 weeks in April, taking Maggie, who was 3 and could travel, and leaving Edward with Arthur because separating a 7-year-old from his routine and school term seemed unnecessary. She arrived in St. Louis to find her mother thinner and more tired but fundamentally herself, which was to say sharp and opinionated and full of evaluations of Annie's appearance, the state of Annie's hair, and the general condition of the world. The health concern was real but not immediately critical. The doctor called it a heart condition that required rest and careful management, which Harriet received with the resigned displeasure of a woman who found rest a poor use of time. Annie arranged, over her 3 weeks, to hire a woman to come in daily and help with the house, which Harriet agreed to only after Annie pointed out that refusing would mean Annie would have to visit much more frequently to check on her. "That is manipulation," Harriet said. "It is," Annie agreed. "I learned it from you." Harriet looked at her for a moment and then made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Harriet Maddox generally permitted herself. "Your father would have been very proud," she said. "Not just of the writing, of all of it, of who you are." Annie took this home to Kansas with her, carried it carefully the whole journey, and gave it to Arthur in words that same evening, because she had learned from him that some things deserved to be said aloud rather than kept. The book she had published in 1887 had a second printing in 1890, which the Chicago publisher wrote to tell her was unusual for a book of that nature and reflected ongoing interest in the subject. She had been working on a second book in the evenings since 1889, this one broader in scope, an examination of legal justice in the frontier period, using multiple cases from across Kansas and the surrounding territories, the Callaway case as the central thread but woven through a larger pattern. It was ambitious, and she knew it, and she was glad to be working on something she was uncertain she was capable of, because she had found that the best work happened at the edge of her confidence rather than safely inside it. Arthur read the chapters as she wrote them, which had become their particular pattern, and he asked questions that were consistently the right questions, pointing not at weaknesses in the writing, but at places where the thinking had not yet gone deep enough, which was more useful. Edward, at 8, had discovered that he liked history with the same focused urgency he had previously applied to horses, and he had opinions about Kansas territorial history that he shared at length at the supper table. Arthur engaged with these opinions with the same quality of attention he gave to everything serious, and Annie took notes in her journal, and thought that whatever else happened in her life, this table, these people, this particular quality of loud, interested, warm daily presence, was the thing she was most grateful for. The summer of 1891 was hot and dry, harder than the summer of 1883 had been, and the cattle country in southeastern Kansas was under pressure. Arthur managed his operation through it with the methodical, careful intelligence that characterized everything he did, selling off a portion of the herd before the drought reduced their condition, conserving water with systems he had been developing since the previous dry summer. Some of his neighbors were not as fortunate or as prepared. He helped where he could, sharing what resources the operation could spare, which was not nothing and was not enough, because droughts respect no one's goodwill. Annie wrote about the drought for the Kansas City Star in 2 pieces that drew substantial response, one about the immediate agricultural impact, and one about the structural vulnerabilities of small cattle operations in the face of climate variability, which anticipated, with some precision, conversations that would be had in Kansas for years to come. She was told by her editor at the Star that these were her best column pieces and should probably be in the second book. She put them in the second book. The drought broke in October with 3 days of steady rain that left the prairie smelling of wet grass and deep relief. Arthur stood on the porch in the rain for a few minutes, just standing, and Annie came out and stood beside him, and they did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said about rain when you have been watching the land suffer for a season. In December 1891, 9 years after the verdict that had changed both their lives, Annie and Arthur Rhodes rode into Harrow Creek for the town's Christmas gathering, which was held in the new meeting hall and attended by essentially everyone in a 15-mile radius. Edward was 9, and in the grip of a serious period of intellectual development that expressed itself in asking every adult present questions they were not entirely certain how to answer. Maggie was 4 and had made friends, within the first 20 minutes, with every child in the room and 2 of the dogs. Clara Dunn held court from a chair near the fire with the authority of a woman who has been at the center of things for a long time and has no intention of relocating. James Faber had come from Medicine Lodge with his wife, who was a warm, practical woman named Helen who had known James for 20 years and had the particular ease of someone who likes exactly where they are. Tom Bright and Nora stood with their 3 children, and there was a sense in the room of something that was not just a Christmas gathering, but a community that had built itself out of diverse and difficult materials into something that held. Annie stood at the edge of the room with Arthur beside her and watched it all and thought about the October afternoon. She had arrived on the stagecoach from Abilene, alone and purposeful and already half a person more than she had been before, and the February anniversary of that arrival and all the distance between them. "What are you thinking?" Arthur asked. He could read when she was working through something. "That I should have written it all differently," she said. "The first article, the one that introduced you to the Tribune's readers." He looked at her. "I described you as a suspect with no local connections," she said, "which was factually accurate, but I should have said, a man who reads in jail, because that was the detail that mattered." "It was the detail that mattered to you," he said. "Yes," she said, "and it turned out to be the most important kind." He brought her hand up in that same gesture from the 1st December. The old-fashioned press of his lips to her knuckles that she had never gotten over, and had never told him she had never gotten over. And she looked at him in the lamplight of the Harrow Creek meeting hall, surrounded by the people who had become, over 9 years, the fabric of their life. And she thought that the story she had arrived to tell had turned out to be a different story from the one she had expected, and that it was better. It was better in every way a story can be better. It was true, which she had always required. It had justice in it, which she had worked for. It had resolution, real resolution, not the forced kind, but the kind that comes when you do the difficult things correctly, and the truth matters enough to people with courage enough to act on it. And it had this: Arthur Rhodes beside her, and children, and Clara Dunn holding court by the fire, and the Kansas winter outside the windows doing what Kansas winters do, and a life that was full in every way she had not known to want when she arrived on a stagecoach with a notebook and a train ticket she planned to use in the other direction. The verdict had changed her plans. He had changed her plans. She had, in the end, been the one to stay. She was glad, every morning that she woke up in the ranch house east of Harrow Creek, with the writing room catching the first eastern light, and the sounds of her children beginning to move through the house and Arthur's even breathing beside her. She was glad with the kind of gladness that does not announce itself, but is simply present, like good light, like water in October, like the quiet voice of a man reading Hardy through the bars of a jail window on an afternoon that changed the shape of everything that followed. She was supposed to leave after the trial. The verdict had changed her plans, and so had he, and she had not for a single morning of the 9 years since wished it otherwise. Edward grew to become a serious young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and he did indeed, at 15, write his first article for the Harrow Creek Register, a piece about the history of the Callaway fraud case drawn from the newspaper archives and his mother's book, which his teacher assigned to the class that year with Annie's somewhat bemused permission. He was embarrassed and proud simultaneously, which she recognized as the correct response to having your parents' work taught as literature. Maggie, at 12, was still the most socially successful member of the family by a considerable margin, and had taken to horses with a seriousness that suggested her future would involve them professionally in some capacity, a conclusion Arthur received with what Annie recognized as pure, uncomplicated happiness. And the years went forward, as years do in good lives, full and specific and sometimes difficult, and always, under all of it, grounded in the extraordinary, ordinary daily fact of two people who had found each other in impossible circumstances and chosen, repeatedly and consciously, to keep finding each other every day after. Harrow Creek grew and changed around them, and they grew and changed within it, and the writing room in the ranch house continued to catch the morning light, and the cattle moved through the seasons in their ancient patient way, and Arthur Rhodes continued to read in the evenings, and Annie Maddox continued to write, and the story of the verdict and the changed plans and the woman who stayed was told, in the end, not in a newspaper or a book, but in the accumulated weight of a life lived fully and honestly and together, which is the only kind of telling that lasts.